13 African countries rejected Donald Trump's offers, on live record. Why would entire nations turn down billions in aid, infrastructure, and power? What did Trump demand that made Africa walk away? The shock wasn't that Africa said no. The shock was how many said it, loudly, deliberately, and without hesitation. 13 countries, 13 refusals. But these weren't the usual closed-door, carefully worded diplomat. Let's start with South Africa. Trump's offer was simple on paper: better trade access and agricultural incentives. But the demand behind it was unthinkable: abandon BRICS. In essence, the US told Pretoria to give up its role in a growing anti-Western economic bloc in exchange for a handshake. And worse, Trump's administration stoked the flames with claims of white genocide, pushing for the resettlement of white South African farmers in America. To President Cyril Ramaphosa, this was more than offensive. It was an attempt to racialize foreign policy, destabilize domestic politics, and pull South Africa into America's culture wars. He didn't just reject the offer, he used it as fuel to push closer to China and Russia. Then came Ghana. When US officials arrived in Accra with a $500 million military assistance proposal, they likely expected gratitude. Instead, they encountered suspicion. The deal included language that allowed US troops extended access to Ghanaian facilities and exempted American personnel from local laws. The catch: Ghana would have little oversight. The backlash at home was swift. Citizens protested, opposition parties rallied, and Ghana's president quietly backed away. Ghana didn't just say no, they turned the moment into a pivot, accelerating bilateral discussions with Turkey, Russia, and China instead. Nigeria's case was perhaps the most direct insult disguised as diplomacy. The Trump administration offered major investments in the oil sector, but hidden in the paperwork was a demand for a 51% controlling interest in key extraction zones. The message was crystal clear: America wanted to own Nigeria's crown jewel. For a country whose identity is tightly interwoven with its oil sovereignty, it was a red line. The Nigerian government walked out of negotiations. That same month, Chinese energy firms secured exploration licenses in the Niger Delta. Kenya's story added another layer: legal surrender. A $3.6 billion infrastructure proposal came with a clause that shocked Nairobi. In the event of a dispute, arbitration would occur in American courts, not in Kenya, not in neutral territory, in the US judicial system. Essentially, the deal gave Washington final legal authority over Kenyan projects on Kenyan soil. Kenya rejected the offer, not out of spite, but out of survival. Days later, they secured a similar infrastructure deal with Beijing, minus the legal colonization. And then there was Tanzania. When the Trump administration offered COVID-19 vaccines and medical infrastructure, they assumed urgency would push the government to accept. But the terms were chilling: no transparency on trial data, no clarity on side effects, and little respect for Tanzanian health regulators. It was a demand for blind trust. Instead, the late President John Magufuli chose a slower but more sovereign path, turning to China and India for medical partnerships that offered documentation, oversight, and dignity. These cases weren't connected by coincidence. They were tied by a pattern. Each country was offered something flashy: money, infrastructure, security, but always with a cost that targeted their laws, their assets, or their political alliances. And that pattern leads us to a bigger question, one even more dangerous than any clause in a contract. What if it was never just about the deals? What if it was about the man offering them? Let's take a closer look at how Trump himself became the reason these doors closed. If the terms of the deals were the trigger, Donald Trump was the gunpowder. Behind every rejected offer, there was a growing discomfort not just with the fine print, but with the man. Trump didn't just underestimate Africa. He misread it, and Trump's entire approach to diplomacy was deeply transactional, almost theatrical. He treated summits like campaign rallies, press briefings like sales pitches, and partnerships like one-sided negotiations. African diplomats noticed how he addressed their presidents by first names in press events, how he interrupted or contradicted them mid-sentence, and how he used their photo ops to reinforce his America First image. Even ceremonial behavior became a red flag. In 2018, during a UN speech where he boasted about his administration's accomplishments, world leaders, including African delegates, were caught on camera laughing. It wasn't staged, it was spontaneous disbelief. That moment said everything. The room wasn't with him, it was watching him. For many African leaders, Trump was not just unpredictable, he was strategically dangerous. His administration often bypassed protocol, sending envoys with vague titles, issuing statements before consultations, and treating sovereign governments as junior partners. He once offered Sudan removal from the insurgency list, only if it recognized Israel within a fixed deadline. To African eyes, it felt more like a game show than diplomacy. And then there was the silence. During major crises affecting African nations, floods in Mozambique, protests in Nigeria, the Ebola response in the DRC, Trump remained mute or distracted. His administration rarely acknowledged these events unless they served a U.S. narrative. The absence of empathy was noticed. That silence stood in contrast to his loud endorsements elsewhere. He frequently praised authoritarian leaders, joked about staying in office beyond 2 terms, and once mused about buying Greenland, raising questions about how he viewed sovereignty at all. For African countries that had fought long battles for independence, Trump's behavior wasn't just offensive, it was triggering. It brought back the image of the outsider with money and power, expecting obedience in return. So even when his administration came offering security, or roads, or aid, the question remained, at what cost to our dignity? The message from Africa was subtle but sharp. You cannot insult us on Monday and invest on Friday. You cannot degrade us in speeches and expect handshakes in meetings. Respect is not retroactive, and diplomacy is not a performance. And the result? Trump's diplomacy didn't just hurt his deals, it helped unify African leaders around a shared instinct. This relationship had to change. The trust was broken, and the continent was ready to look elsewhere, not just because of contracts, but because of character. And that shift wasn't limited to emotions, it had real geopolitical consequences. So the question becomes, where did Africa turn when the US doors closed, and what new alliances began to form in the shadows? Let's follow the path. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Once the trust was gone, the pivot began. By the time Donald Trump's presidency approached its 3rd year, African leaders weren't just rejecting deals, they were replacing them, not with thin air, but with new players. While Trump insulted, demanded, and dictated, other powers watched quietly and moved strategically. And it was China that moved fastest. Beijing understood what Trump never did. Respect doesn't cost a dime, and silence often speaks louder than insults. Without fanfare, Chinese delegations expanded across the continent, attending summits, funding projects, and offering deals without the humiliating language. Unlike the Trump administration, which framed aid as rescue, China pitched it as business. No savior complex, no moral superiority. Just roads, railways, ports, and returns. That tone mattered. In Angola, Beijing's infrastructure investments expanded while Trump's Africa policy remained vague. In Zambia, Chinese tech firms replaced shelved U.S. proposals. And in Ethiopia, when the U.S. pulled back after political unrest, China moved in with satellite and surveillance partnerships. But this wasn't just about China. It was about BRICS and the emerging philosophy they represented. While Washington offered deals with demands, BRICS offered collaboration with conditions negotiated on equal footing. India began pushing pharmaceutical and tech deals in East Africa. Russia sent mining and energy experts to Mali, Guinea, and Sudan. Even Brazil re-engaged diplomatically in Lusophone Africa, rekindling cultural and agricultural exchanges. Africa wasn't choosing the East out of desperation. It was choosing it out of design. Because these new alliances weren't just economic, they were symbolic. They marked a divorce from the post-Cold War era, where Africa was seen as a prize in Western geopolitical chess. Now the board was flipped, and Africa was choosing its partners. Trump's failure created a vacuum, but it didn't remain empty for long. As U.S. embassies struggled with diplomatic fatigue, Chinese-built embassies, stadiums, hospitals, and schools dotted the skyline of African capitals. As Trump cut pandemic-era funding, India and Russia sent medical advisors and supplies. Even culturally, the balance was shifting. African students are increasingly enrolled in Chinese and Turkish universities. Local tech hubs collaborated with Indian developers. And more African media outlets began broadcasting BRICS summit coverage with the same energy they once reserved for Washington briefings. This wasn't anti-Americanism, it was post-Americanism. A quiet but decisive break from one-sided dependency. And in a sense, Trump made it easier. His crude diplomacy made the alternative seem not just viable, but attractive. His rejection of climate treaties, global health initiatives, and multilateralism made BRICS look like the adult in the room. And as the US burned bridges, the East built new ones, stone by stone. It's important to note, the BRICS shift didn't come from pressure. It came from the invitation. No one told African nations to choose sides. They simply saw where they were respected and where they were not. So when Trump's term ended, it wasn't just a presidency that ended. It was an era. The era of default American influence in Africa was gone, replaced by an ecosystem of options, flexibility, and leverage. But this new alignment came with something deeper, a lesson. If a superpower can fall out of favor so quickly, what else have African nations quietly tolerated for too long? What other relationships had been one-sided? What patterns were now too obvious to ignore? It was no longer about Trump. It was about a system. And now, Africa was ready to confront that system directly. The real break wasn't with Trump. It was with history. When African countries began rejecting the Trump administration's proposals and realigning themselves with BRICS, many in the West assumed it was ideological, maybe even opportunistic. But they missed the deeper truth. These weren't just political decisions, they were historical corrections. Because beneath every rejection letter, every cold handshake, every new Chinese-funded highway, there was an old wound. Africa remembers. It remembers the scramble, when European powers carved it up like a cake without a single African at the table. It remembers forced treaties, fake borders, and stolen names. It remembers missionaries who came with Bibles and left with gold. And it remembers what came next, the so-called independence followed by debt traps, puppet regimes, IMF ultimatums, and aid that always had a catch. Trump didn't create that legacy. He just reminded Africa how alive it still was. When his administration offered deals tied to US court rulings, or demanded control over national resources, or insulted leaders in public, it wasn't new. It was familiar. It sounded like Leopold, like Rhodes, like the British East India Company. Africa had heard these voices before. This time, they just had American accents. The rejection of Trump was not just about bad deals, it was about the psychological refusal to relive the past. Consider the symbolism. Trump's team offered financial packages that would legally bind nations to US oversight, but wrapped them in terms like assistance or stabilization. To African governments, this was déjà vu. These were the same types of contracts colonial officers once used to seize land, enforce labor, or rig trade. Worse still, the cultural messaging remained just as condescending. African leaders noticed how Western media framed their refusals, not as acts of sovereignty, but as short-sighted or risky. The very act of saying no was treated as a mistake, as if independence were still a phase, not a status. And this arrogance has a cost. The more Africa pushed back, the more the West retaliated, just like old times. After rejecting Trump's offers, Ghana faced travel restrictions. South Africa endured tariffs. Nigeria saw US companies quietly exit contracts. The punishment came quickly, just not as loud as before. Yet something had changed. This time, Africa didn't flinch, because now it had options. And more importantly, it had confidence. The same continent once forced to beg for debt forgiveness was now dictating new investment terms. The same countries once used as test markets for Western products were now negotiating bilateral trade with China, India, and Brazil on equal terms. Trump was merely a trigger. The deeper reaction was against the system he represented, a Western framework that still treats African sovereignty as conditional and African dignity as negotiable. And that's why the shift isn't reversible. Because it's not a trend, it's a reckoning. Africa is no longer trying to prove its worth to the West. It's now asking the West to explain why it should be trusted at all. And that question brings us to the present moment. If history has returned and trust has collapsed, what comes next? Can Africa afford to stay in this standoff forever? Or is it already building a new foundation? Once the ghosts of the past were confronted, something remarkable happened. Africa stopped playing defense. The Trump-era rejections weren't just a symbolic rejection of a leader, they were the birth of a doctrine. Quietly, without grand announcements or flashy slogans, African nations began to build something new. A foreign policy rooted not in fear of exclusion, but in confidence of value. No more silent acceptance of lopsided deals. No more performative handshakes with condescending powers. The age of begging saw themselves on the world stage. For decades, the continent had been conditioned to think in terms of aid and survival. The West offered development in exchange for obedience. Loans came with lectures, summits were attended with hats in hand. But after Trump, African leaders saw that even when the offers came with threats, they could walk away and not collapse. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The refusal became a strategy. Instead of waiting for deals to arrive from Washington, capitals like Addis Ababa, Pretoria, and Accra began designing their investment models, shopping them globally, on African terms. Public infrastructure tenders now come with clauses protecting land, labor, and local ownership. Medical agreements demanded data transparency. Military partnerships require mutual legal accountability. The world noticed, China adapted, Russia complied. Even the EU began adjusting its tone, issuing more conciliatory language in recent policy papers. France, Africa's most heavy-handed post-colonial player, has faced protests, embassy attacks, and base closures in former colonies, as citizens demand a full expulsion of French presence. This doctrine of African-first diplomacy isn't isolationist, it's selective. African nations aren't shutting the world out. They're choosing who gets in and how, and the bar has risen. If a nation comes offering roads, they better come without strings. If they offer military aid, they had better come with respect. If they claim to be partners, they must sit as equals. And here's the most critical part. This shift isn't just happening at the top. It's flowing from the bottom up. Young Africans, activists, entrepreneurs, farmers, and engineers are no longer inspired by the West. They're building African apps, watching African news, wearing African fashion, and speaking native languages with pride. The post-Western generation isn't dreaming of New York or Paris. They're dreaming of ownership, of their land, their wealth, their narrative. The Trump moment acted like a match, lighting the fuel that had long been building under the surface. It was a diplomatic embarrassment, but it triggered a cultural awakening. By trying to dictate terms from a position of arrogance, the U.S. exposed how fragile its influence had become. And in that exposure, Africa found its leverage. Now the continent is moving from resistance to leadership, from reaction to strategy, from the receiving end of history to the writing end of it. This isn't a phase, it's a turning point. The age of conditional deals is ending. The new rule is simple. No dignity, no deal. No respect, no alliance. No equality, no entry. And that's why this story doesn't end with Trump. It begins with what Africa did after Trump, when it realized it never needed permission to stand tall. Because in the end, Africa didn't just reject a man. It declared, "We are done asking. From now on, we decide." Do you think Africa will ever bow to the West? Why can't the West accept this fact? Let us know in the comment section how long it will take Trump to realize Africa is no longer the same. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.